All right. Hello, everyone who has joined today. Thank you for stopping by. I see a couple familiar faces in the chat already. Thanks, Marco, for the birthday wishes. Today is going to be another, what do you want to call it? Office hours on Turbo Native. So this is going to be time for you as folks that are tuning in to ask questions on how to build Turbo Native apps, how to do specific things with Turbo Native apps, how to get started. I'm just going to give a few more seconds for folks to start to join. We're only a few minutes late, a few minutes behind right now. We should probably go about an hour. If there's more questions, we'll go a little bit longer. And if there's fewer, we'll stop a little early. So really quick, before we dive in, hi everyone, my name is Joe. I do Turbo Native development. I take Ruby on Rails apps and convert them to iOS apps that you can then deploy into the App Store with Turbo Native. So the big heavy hitters there are Hey and Basecamp. Those are the ones that are leading this initiative right now. I've launched about a dozen or so of these through client work or my own work through like something like Rails Devs, and have built up a lot of experience and kind of expertise in this space. So what I'd like to see is if folks start to have questions, just pop them over in the chat. I'll see everything from YouTube and Twitch. I won't see anything from Twitter, unfortunately. So if you do have a question and you're watching this on Twitter, please pop into the YouTube link or the Twitch and ask a question there, because StreamYard does not yet support posting from Twitter replies. So without further ado, let's dive in. Again, any questions, just pop them over in the chat. There will be a little bit of a delay as the recording software catches up, but as soon as I start to see questions come in, I will start to answer them as we walk through. If you want to hop on video, let me know in the chat as well. I can invite you, and we can also do video, and we'll get started as soon as someone has some questions to dive into. Abdullahi, if I mispronounced your name, I apologize, but you're asking for more Turbo Native content on this channel coming from YouTube. Sure, here it is. I would definitely love to start doing more Turbo Native content, especially video. It's something that I've been experimenting with a lot more, especially these like live feeds. So great to hear that it's working for you and that video is a good way to consume this content. 2 weeks ago, I did a little crash course on how to do kind of Swift for Ruby developers. That's on my channel as well. If you haven't checked that out, a really good way to jumpstart into iOS development as a Ruby or Rails dev there. Would recommend that as well. If anyone who's just joining now, please just ask some questions in the chat. And if we don't have anything pop up soon, I will just start diving into kind of how I think about Turbo Native apps and how I build them. What we'll do is we'll just start building one from scratch. So question from Gorka, does Turbo Native work with Swift UI? Yes. The short answer is yes, and the long answer is that we can make it work with a couple workarounds. Thanks, Mike, appreciate that birthday wishes. So iOS and Turbo Native, the way it works right now, is built on top of UIKit, and there's not really a way to integrate it directly into Swift UI only apps. That said, there is something called a UI hosting controller, which I'll show you in a second, that can bridge the gap between your UIKit apps and Swift UI. So what that means is that we can have a standard, Turbo Native UIKit app with all the UI navigation controller, UI tab bar controller stuff that we're used to, but kind of drop into Swift UI when we want. So what I'll do here is let's show how that works. So what I'm going to do here is pop open this is the Turbo Navigator, navigation controller, or the Turbo Navigator. So let's open up the demo project here. And what this is if I pop open to Safari, this is GitHub, Joe Mazzalotti, Turbo Navigator. This is kind of like a quick wrapper for Turbo iOS just to make things a little bit cleaner to work with. It handles a lot of like all of these different navigation flows, like pushing things onto the stack, popping modals, all that good stuff. But what it does is it gives us a really good place to start with Turbo Native and makes it really easy if we open up that demo. So what we can do here is the first thing is that this demo needs to be cleaned. So what's happening now is that Xcode cannot find our packages for some reason. So we're just going to try closing this and closing out this project as well. And we're going to reopen the project and see if that triggers a dependency upload here. We'll try to build with Command B. And we succeeded. So great. We'll run that. And then also there is a demo server. So I look at my directory here. I'm in that like, oops. Let's hop into the Turbo Navigator, cd into the demo server directory. And we can just start that server, which will give us a nice little playground to play with. So we have that nice error page. We'll retry. We'll get that navigation. So SwiftUI, we talked about, we wanted to dive into how that works. So we have our our scene delegate here, and we have a Turbo Navigator, which is that class that kind of gives callback to us. What I'm going to do here is in the Turbo Navigation delegate, implement the controller for proposal method. And what we want to do here is when we get this method, it's saying, what controller do you want to return when a proposal, when this like view is, or this URL is visited? So notice this is a UI view controller. It's UI kit, right? So what we'll do here is we'll say if the proposal URL path components dot last equals Joe, or let's say equals profile. And even better is that if we actually want to just say straight up the URL dot path equals slash profile. So anytime we find, we hit the slash profile URL. Otherwise, we're just going to want to return that default controller here. Here we want to say we're going to create a profile controller, and we're going to want to return that. So we haven't created the profile controller yet, so let's do that. Down here we can just create a new controller called a profile controller. And what we're going to want to do here is inherit from UI hosting controller. And to do that, we need to import SwiftUI. UI hosting controller is a way of wrapping our Swift UI views in a way that works with UIKit. So what we'll do here is it will override the initializer, and we'll say that our root view equals a profile view. And then we'll call super init, just build that to let the compiler fix it for us. What the profile view is, we want to type that, make sure that is typed. It needs to know what profile view is. So what we're going to do here is create a new file. We're going to create a SwiftUI view called profile view. This will give us a, call this profile. What this does is it gives us a SwiftUI view, which inherits from view. It gives us a preview that we can then preview over here. A very simple one. It's just going to have the text that shows profile view. Once I build this, I'll show you the demo. So let's comment this out so we can build. We'll comment this out. And we can see here on the preview, these always take a quick second to load the first time. So be patient with this one. We're going to see text in the middle of the screen that says profile view, rendered from our SwiftUI view here. And there we have it. We have a nice, just boring old profile view. Back in our controller, or sorry, our scene delegate, let's build this now. We need to implement the default initializer. This is always going to come in from SwiftUI, from UIKit. It's that we always need to implement Coder. That's when you're coming from a storyboard. This app doesn't use storyboards, so we're just not going to worry about that. And then finally here, we want to do a super init with root view, profile view. So now what that means is that when we initialize a profile controller, we are then just going to immediately override the initializer to create a root view of a profile view. That's how UI hosting controller works. It essentially says, what content do you want to render? And I'll wrap it in UIKit. Really helpful for us getting native screens onto the stack. So we run this, and we're never going to actually get into here because we're never actually visiting the profile path. So what we can do here is open up our server code, and we have a dashboard show page, which is what we're seeing over on the right. Let's just clean this up a little bit. And we have a navigation item to the new modal path. Let's create another navigation item called navigate that directly to /profile. And we'll say native profile screen. Or maybe this should be view profile. Native Swift UI screen. And for the arrow, this is from Bootstrap. Let's see what we got. We can do Bootstrap icons. And maybe there is something that looks like a profile. Perfect. Let's do person circle. So that will be di-person circle. Save that, and we'll see that this automatically reloads for us. And when we click one of these screens, we'll push a turbo controller here. But if we click on profile, we get our native Swift UI screen. So what we did there, to recap, was we overrode the controller for proposal method from the turbo navigation delegate, and then we returned an instance of this UI hosting controller. This UI hosting controller then used our Swift UI view to kind of wrap or to be wrapped in what the framework wanted to present for us, which is UIKit. To do this without the turbo navigator is not much different. What I'm going to do here is open up the demo from Turbo iOS instead. So this is the demo project that you get from the Turbo iOS repo, which is what all this is built off of, right? We have here the demo project. So that's what I have pulled up over here. Here we have a method called didProposeVisit, which is what happens when a link is clicked. This is abstracted in Turbo Navigator. It then routes a URL, and it says, okay, if the path is this, do this thing. Otherwise, make a view controller, blah, 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 blah. Down here in make view controller, we see that we have if let view controller properties is string. Here is where we could do the same thing. If we could switch off of that view controller and do something, like case profile, and then do let profile controller. So same exact concept where we're going to use that UI hosting controller and a Swift UI view, but the hook for it, so to speak, is coming from a little bit deeper in the stack, is coming from the session delegates didProposeVisit instead of in Turbo Navigator, which was the controller for. So why I show you that is because you might not be using Turbo Navigator yet. If you're not, I'd love for you if you could give it a try. It is a package that I'm now using in all of the client work that I do. And it handles just like I said, like a ton of all of these different scenarios where you have a modal on the screen but want to dismiss it, or have a modal but you want to push on top of it. A lot going on there that is just a little bit easier to work with. And instead of your demo project being 138 lines of code plus 116, we can get our whole demo project down to 45 lines of code. So that's the entire app outside of error handling, which is just a small error presenter. No, it's not small. It's because it's all UIKit. This is all just creating a view in UIKit. If you ignore the error handling, we're down to 34 lines of code here, which is pretty great to get a Turbo native app working. So thanks for that question. Remind me, that was from Gorka. Hopefully that answers your question. And if it didn't, let me know and I can dive in a little bit more. So I have another question here from Marco who says, I've been toying I've been toying with the idea of writing a Ruby version for Swift UI, so that you can write Swift UI similar to Flex, but it being rendered and fetched from the server side. That sounds really friggin' awesome. And if that ends up becoming a thing that is working, I would love to see that for sure. I haven't experimented with any like server side rendering stuff yet with Swift, mostly because I feel like it's been done by big companies already, and I don't have examples to share, but I could, and I haven't really heard wind of it. And the fact that I haven't heard about it yet makes me think that either it's a project that isn't needed, that's not actually solving a problem, or that it's a really hard problem to solve and folks haven't figured it all out. What I can say though is that building out Swift UI screens can be very, very simple. You can have things like VStacks and HStacks to align your content. The difficulty comes from the modifiers that get added to different things. And having a way to translate every single modifier to your iOS app could start to become a really large library because it all has to be statically typed. There's very little dynamicness, if that's a word, in Swift. So every single modifier that is added to a specific view would need its own implementation or its own mapping, so to speak. And yeah, you could run some generated code, but I'd love to see where you go with that, Marco. That sounds super interesting, and I would definitely be interested in testing that out for a beta. If that was ever integrated into Turbo iOS as well, that would be really powerful because now you could build your entire app from the server and not have to actually dive into Xcode outside of maybe some sort of like sample or example project. So would love to see where you go with that one. Okay. Thanks for the birthday wishes, everyone. Appreciate it. Looking for any more, if anyone has any more questions on Turbo Native, now's the time to ask those. I'll give the chat a few more minutes to propose any questions, and if not, I will dive into a little bit of demo that I've been having fun experimenting with. So we have a question here that's asks about Strata. Strata with a D, I believe. So, I mean, I think that Strata with a T was a copyright or something, so they got rid of it. But the little that I know about Strata is that you don't need to wait for it to start building Turbo native apps. The consensus or the general idea I have from it is that it will be a way to simplify some of the code. It used to be Strata. Thanks, Marco. From my understanding is that it simplifies some of the code around the Turbo native JavaScript bridge. So if you aren't using the JavaScript bridge, you won't get any benefit from it. And second is that it doesn't do anything that you can't already do with Turbo iOS out of the box already. If you are doing a lot of JavaScript bridge interaction where you're sending a message to the client and that client is then passing a message back to the server and you're kind of doing that two-way communication, Strata will give you a lot of help in reducing the amount of boilerplate code that you write. It's not going to change your iOS app in a way that you can't build it out now. It will just kind of make it a little bit easier to work with those JavaScript APIs. And to be honest, will be very welcome because dealing with JavaScript APIs is not very convenient right now. There's a lot of boilerplate and a lot of kind of hoops you have to jump through just to get it working. And have something that's more standardized, something that actually will communicate two-way without having to leave Swift as much or without having to leave JavaScript as much will be really welcome. So I can't say more about Strata than that right now, but the short of it is don't wait for it. You don't need it. But if you do want to use it, it will hopefully reduce a little bit of code in your code base and move that into the dependency of Strata and of your app. So thanks for the question there. Cool. So while I wait for, yeah, again, from Marco there, it's super lightweight and just reduces some boilerplate. There you go. That sounds in line with what I've been hearing about Strata as well. And like I said, if you're looking to reduce a ton of boilerplate, like this isn't going to help you get started with Turbo Native. I think that it was billed a little bit aggressively when it first came out as like, this is the missing link to bridging the gap. And it does bridge the gap, but only around the JavaScript bridge. It doesn't actually bridge the gap around, like, you still need to know how to work with Turbo Native. You still need to write Swift or Kotlin and that kind of stuff. So take it for what it is, but I wouldn't be holding your breath for it, even if it doesn't get delayed again. Cool. So while I wait for some more questions, I'm going to dive into something that I've been really excited about, and that is a way to work with URLs that drive the entire functionality of the app. Okay, one more question. Thank you for these. I know there's a little bit of delay, so apologies if this is like all out of sorts. Do I plan on a new workshop? Yes, there is a workshop happening just next Monday on the 15th. I will drop a link in the chat right here for those folks who haven't checked it out yet. It will be May 15th at 10 a.m. Pacific, so an hour before this started. There we are. There is the link there, I guess, to the Turbo Native workshop. Tickets are on sale. I'm holding it to only be 20 people, and there already are a few slots that have been taken. So if you do want to get on that, now's probably the right time to buy a ticket. I am sending a blast out to my email list early next week, so I'm expecting them to all sell out pretty soon there. The workshop will be 3 hours long. It will have a nice little break in the middle to kind of go on your own and work out something. But we're going to be covering a lot of exciting stuff there. So reading from the workshop page, we're going to be diving into like how to use Turbo Native, what it means to integrate into a brand new project, how to think like an iOS developer. So there's like, the difference between request response cycles and having state in your app. We'll also uncover a little bit of how to make your app feel more native in terms of using some like hidden routes in Rails that are super exciting that don't really get a lot of talk. And then we'll wrap up with authenticating users with Devise through web-based auth that you can then use for native HTTP requests. And that will power a Swift UI screen. So what we talked about at the beginning of this, the first question, how to do a Swift UI screen, we'll dive into that, but in way more detail. Not only just a static screen, we'll actually be pulling data from an API on your Rails app through an authenticated request. So that means that you can start to have really native screens and really high fidelity work for those very specific stuff that you want to call out and make the absolute best. One of my clients is working with a technique that we're going to learn there on how to make offline access available to their Turbo Native app. So the user launches the app, and if they have internet service, it kind of downloads a bunch of JSON in the background. And then when they launch the app in the future, if they don't have service, it automatically loads and populates that JSON request as if it were coming from the server, which means that we can start to spit out native screens from that JSON that's been cached in the device. Really helpful for folks that either don't have good service or are traveling and they don't want to use their internet connection. They can kind of cache their data offline before they start, and then get that later when they need it. So that's the quick rundown on the workshop. Again, tickets are limited for that. I want to keep the group pretty small. So if you're interested, definitely grab a ticket now. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. My email's at the bottom of that page. If you have any questions on like if it's the right fit for you, or if it's too advanced or too beginner, I'm happy to answer anything like that. So what I have here is, what is this? This is the demo of the Turbo Navigation demo. So I'm just going to keep trucking along with something here while I wait for questions from the chat. If you have one, pop it in, and we will get to it right away. But until then, I will share my screen over here. So what we have here, again, is that Turbo Native, Turbo Navigator code base. It's that scene delegate. It's pointing to local host. What I want to dive into is a little bit about how the path configuration works, because I think this is something that's a little bit confusing with Turbo Native, and it's a really powerful asset if you know how to leverage it correctly. So from the docs here, we have the path configuration docs on Turbo iOS here. And what it says is that we have a JSON endpoint that has two properties, settings and rules. And this JSON file lives both on your client and on your server. But by it living on the server, it means that you can change it dynamically based on who the user is, based on what features you want to enable, or if you want to start doing different native routes and native screens. So it gives your app this little bit of like remote configuration because it's requested as soon as the app launches and then cached for future releases, future versions. So settings is an arbitrary key value pair thing where you can just start like adding stuff. They show an example here of enabling feature X, true or false. I'm not going to dive into settings because I don't use them that often, but rules is super powerful. Rules is an array of hashes with two keys, patterns and properties. And patterns is a regex-like matcher that enables you to route specific paths on your server to give them different properties. So here, what happens is that /new, $ meaning end of the route, so anything that ends in /new or /edit will automatically get the path property presentation set to modal. What that means is that if we pop into our, this is the back in the demo of Turbo iOS, so you know that you can just download this code base right away. You don't have to worry about pulling anything specific. I'm going to set a breakpoint here on the view controller properties section. And we're going to make sure that we're pointing to basic. Actually, no, we'll want to point to local. Give me 1 second to think about that. Yeah, let's pop open. There we are. And we'll do local. So this should be hitting our local server now. Cool. Okay, so this is running from our local if we wanted to change anything here. That breakpoint here that you saw is every time we want to make a view controller in the iOS app, right? So when I click this screen and navigate to another web page, we get into make view controller and it's going to read this properties from the path properties of the URL. So this is directly mapping back to this right here. And we print out down in the bottom of the screen, which you unfortunately can't see because of the banner. So let's hide that banner for a sec. So I'm down here in the bottom of the screen. I'm printing out the properties. Nothing. We have no elements, right? Which means that we're just going to fall through and return a normal view controller that routes our URL. However, if we click intercept with a native view, we'll start to see down in the bottom that properties has a key value pair. The key is view controller and the value is numbers. So where did that come from? How did this properties get added into the view here, or sorry, the property? Let's open up our Turbo Native demo server that it comes with the iOS app. We're going to look at the path at the configuration views. That's right. It doesn't actually hit one on the server. It only comes from the local path configuration.json file. So here's where they're just doing a local a version here. They're not having one on the server. They're only having one that exists locally. This will get overridden by the server if you have one. And here they're routing anything that ends in /numbers to get the properties view controller equals numbers. And that's exactly what we're seeing here, right? We have the URL is /numbers, and the properties are view controller value numbers, or view controller key numbers value. This is a hash, and it's a terrible way to print out a hash. I apologize. That's just how Swift works. But to read it this way: 0 is one element. At the 0 index, there's a key and a value. So when we continue on that, we're going to see that we're going to get a native controller, a native screen here. When we click one of these, we're also getting a visit. Even though we are going from a native screen to another native screen. And if we print out our URL, we're getting /number/5, and our properties are presentation, modal, and view controller numbers detail. So this is coming from now /numbers/ID, 0 or 1 or more ending path, view controller numbers detail, presentation, modal. When we continue there, what we're going to get is a modal, little tiny dialog box, an alert box with the number 5, all native. But how did they go from a native screen to another native screen when we don't actually have a visit being asked? So this breakpoint's a really good place to start, right? I click row 3. You'll see over here that I have a stack trace. We're here. We came from there, from there, from there, from there. This grayed out code is not ours, so we can click it, but it's just going to be like assembly code or something that we don't need to worry about. So if I navigate down the stack, we'll see that we came from this screen, which was route URL. We know how we got there. We came down from push on Turbo Navigation Controller, but that one came from the numbers view controller. The numbers view controller is the screen that we're looking at right now. This is the numbers view controller. We have a table view did select row. That is the callback for when you click a row on a table view in native Swift UI kit. What we're doing is we're grabbing our navigation controller and force casting it as a Turbo Navigation Controller. So this is a kind of a sneaky way of grabbing a reference back to the Turbo Navigation Controller. Every view controller in UIKit has a reference to its navigation controller. It just might be optional sometimes. You'll see that we have a question mark there. So if it's not wrapped in a navigation controller, it will be nil. But if it is, you get a reference to it. And because Turbo Navigation Controller inherits from UI Navigation Controller, we can just use that and force cast it down here because we know as developers that that's how this will work. If this was wrong, if we made a wrong assumption here, this would force the app to crash on us. Really dangerous, really scary, but it puts the onus on the developer to make sure that they're doing it kind of correctly. It's also, you could argue either way that a forced crash, you at least know where the error is happening versus like it's silently failing and people are like, it didn't do anything. So I can go either way with that one. But once we have a reference to the Turbo Nav controller, we can then push a URL. And we're kind of making up a URL here. You notice that we're taking URL, which is the original URL that we got. So that's actually this URL here down the bottom, /numbers. And we're appending the index essentially +1, zero base index. So 0 will become 1, 1 will become 2. And we're pushing that made up URL. If I print this out here, you'll see that we get localhost 45678 /numbers/3. So we're kind of making up a URL to then route back to our Turbo Nav controller. This is a really cool way of keeping all of our navigation in the Turbo Nav controller. We're keeping all of our logic in this kind of one single function, no matter where we're coming from, no matter where we're going. We could be coming from a native screen to a native screen, which is what we're doing right here. We could be coming from a web-based screen to another web-based screen, which is what we would do here. Or we can go from web to native, which is what we're doing right there. It's really powerful, but it also is a little bit flaky. it puts a lot of onus on us as developers to make sure that we always account for this controller, this method going every which way in our app. It becomes the router in a Rails app, but without kind of, but without you have to always know where you're coming from and you're going. So while I love this approach, I think that it could be abstracted a little bit more. And you'll notice right here that they have that warning pretty much. You can use whatever logic you prefer, how to navigate. And they also mention somewhere that like this should be extracted into its own class. In a real app, these would be separate objects. Sometimes not. I don't know if I agree with that necessarily, but this concept of having everything in your app be routed based on a URL is extremely powerful. And it's something that I haven't seen yet in the client work that I've been doing until very recently. The Jumpstart Pro template does not use this concept. It uses the concept of coordinators where every coordinator can only push its children. And they kind of have like a linear approach down. It's not this huge global mess and string of things. That works really well for a template. I think it will continue to work really well for Jumpstart, where we know where the user can go because we kind of control both sides. For a specific iOS app like client work or something where you know that you can go from kind of anywhere to anywhere, I think that this works a little bit better. And I'd recommend taking a look at this in your apps of doing this kind of URL-based routing, I like to call it. It's a really powerful way to go back and forth between screens without having to write a lot of native code, a lot of native glue outside of kind of this one big function, which will continue to grow as you add new functionality to your app, but it at least is contained right here. And you could, of course, could do something where you find a way to abstract this into some protocol or make it, you know, what's the solid principle here where we could extend it but not actually modify it, open for extension but close for modification. This is violating that principle right now. I think that if we wanted to have that work, we'd have some sort of generic protocol that we could then say, okay, create a controller method that gets injected with these properties. I don't know if the code quality matters as much as people talk about right here, but it is a way that you could go if you do feel uncomfortable looking at this and seeing those case statements start to grow more and more and more and more. So that's one way of using the path configuration to get us native screens and route between native and non-native stuff. So just a quick call out if anyone has any more questions. Now's a great time to ask those. We still have another 20 minutes to dive into anything. There's still a couple people hanging around. I would love to answer a few more questions on Turbo Native or any of the stuff that you've had or problems that you've run into using it. So Marco mentions that he'd love to see more of this built into the framework itself. I totally agree. I was recently given commit access to the Turbo iOS repo. I've been merging a couple PRs slowly as I work through the backlog of things, but I do have a little bit more push now into what we as a community want to include in the framework, or sorry, in like the library. And one of the big things that I'm pushing for is to get Turbo Navigator upstreamed into Turbo iOS. That would give iOS developers a lot more flexibility in reducing the boilerplate that they need to write. It means that they'll be able to get up and running in like 50 or 60 lines of code instead of a couple hundred lines of code, and actually be in a better spot too. So that not have to worry about, like if you look at the code that I was just demoing from the Turbo iOS demo, there's a lot of like, we're doing this to make sure that it's easy, or this is a shortcut. And the Turbo Navigator kind of takes all of those and implements them quote for real, not as shortcuts. So gives us a much better starting ground as Turbo Native developers to get off the ground running without having to dive into something as intense or as costly as Jumpstart Pro, which is great for certain projects, but not for every single one that gets going, especially if you don't have a Jumpstart Pro Rails app. Carl chimed in with that would be awesome. I agree. Guides would be helpful too. Yeah, I'm still curious how we as a community, as Rails, as maybe the Rails Foundation is going to look at Turbo Native as part of the Rails slash Hotwire world. If you Google Turbo Native, outside of my articles and my content, there's really nothing, even official. The official docs is like one page on hotwire.dev on going native, and then there's a couple docs buried inside of the Turbo iOS and the Turbo Android library, like code bases, like on GitHub. And I think that kind of sucks because like it's great for me as a content creator. There's a ton that I can cover and a ton that I can work on. But as a developer using this, there really isn't like one place to go to get answers like there are the Rails guides or the Rails API docs or stuff like that. And to have more on that on Turbo Native would be awesome. The closest that I have to kind of like I'm starting from zero, where do I go, is I'm going to drop a link here. This is right here is a link to a 6-part series that I wrote a while back that gets updated pretty frequently on how to get started with iOS on Turbo Native. So it walks through like adding the repo to your code, adding the Swift package to your code base, doing authentication, doing native screens, doing modals. Doesn't touch on tabs yet, but I'm hoping to add that soon. Working with the JavaScript bridge. It does pretty much everything you would need to know to get started, but it's also just from one viewpoint. Like I don't have someone copy editing it like you do the community with the Rails guides. And to have more of that out there in the wild, I think would be really, really helpful. And if you are interested in like helping out with that, please get in touch. I'd love to get you on board with either copy editing or creating more content for it, because I do think there's a gap in the community right now that would be great to fill in. And thanks for the shout out, Marco, there. Marco said he recommends that series, so appreciate that. Okay, so we have 15 minutes left. I'd love to answer one more question, kind of at either a high level question about Turbo Native or a specific one on how you would do something in your app. And looks like Marco just chimed in with something that could be really interesting. So Marco asks, have you used any techniques for extracting data from HTML to then build native screens with it? It's a great question. Yes, to varying levels of success. So I did a quick guide, like a live stream a few months ago at this point, on how to add a native button to the screen from a JavaScript hook. And I think that is good, but I think there could be a lot better answers to that. So 15 minutes, what I could do here is kind of just like dive in and see how far we can get. We'll build out something that is kind of maybe not straightforward, but will at least be helpful in terms of getting started here. So let's see how far we can get in 15 minutes. We have here, we're back in the Turbo iOS demo. We have the scene controller. So what we're looking for is a hook. Let me hide this. What we're looking for is a hook to kind of start extracting content from the HTML. And the way to extract content from the HTML is usually through a JavaScript callback or a JavaScript message. So what we'll do here is we have our app and we have our, so here we have the demo, which I believe is views index. So we should see navigate to another web page. We do. What we'll do here is we will add a fully native screen. Let's think about that. So what we'll do is we'll override intercept with a native view. And instead of building this out with 100 different rows, we will build out a way to dynamically add specific rows to this content. So native screen is going to /numbers. So I think if I add a numbers.ejs file Oh, we already have one. Interesting. So what's happening here? Oh, Marco, maybe I misinterpreted. Marco is thinking, oops, don't see that. I was thinking of some kind of custom HTML elements which have some behavior in the web version, but would also map to actual Swift components. Got it. So when Turbo Native sees them, it can just use data to enrich the experience. That makes sense. Kind of like Stimulus can add JavaScript sprinkles to rendered HTML. This sounds interesting. Let's see. So one thing that I haven't done is ever have a screen that is half web and half native. And it kind of sounds like that's where we're going with this one, where we want to have a portion of the screen, it does sound badass, a portion of the screen be web-based, but then some sort of like tab bar across the bottom or whatever, or some sort of maybe native button. So let's dive back into that. Let's explore that where we could try to do a native button or something somewhere. So let's poke around the app and see where we want to. Okay, this is actually wouldn't be a bad place to start. So we have, this is the index page. This is navigating to another, which is going to one. So if I comment out, oops, if I get rid of that page and refresh. Yeah, cool. So let's see, let's have a div and we'll call it data native equals button. Just kind of totally spitballing here. We're going to just see how far we can get in the last 10 minutes or so. So if I just wrap that in the div native button, div native, let's call it element, and then data native title equals. Yeah, no, I hear you, Marco. Just one idea how you could use the rendered HTML to level up the experience without writing a bunch of native code. Yeah, I think, and then Carl, yeah, I think that there's a lot of different ways that we could go with this one. So I'm not going to dive into any more code just yet because I think that there's a little bit more to unpack in terms of like what we're looking for. But I have two approaches that come to mind. One is that we have a fully native screen that is still powered by, instead of a JSON API, it's powered by the HTML that the normal web view would have rendered. So the example there is that we talked about, or we looked at this screen here, right? Intercept with the native view, which is loading this numbers screen with what, 100 numbers. Oops. All of this code is getting rendered in the numbers controller 100 times. This is like kind of hard coded into our iOS app. If we wanted to show a screen with 50 numbers, we'd have to change our code and redeploy it. However, if you look at localhost 45678, nice, / numbers, you'll notice that it actually only renders 10 on the web. So one approach is that we could be rendering this web content kind of in the background and then using that to populate our native screen once it loads. What that would mean is that this numbers view controller has this URL, right? On load, we could create a web view, load the request. So now we've actually loaded that somewhere in the background. What we're going to do is say that the web view delegate, the navigation delegate equals self. This is now saying we want to get callbacks when the navigation finishes loading. Extend our numbers view controller to be the WK navigation delegate. And when it finishes rendering, which I believe is navigation did, no, not did. Navigation, let's dive in. Command control, click there. Decide policy for response. did start. I thought there was like a did finish, did commit, did finish. Okay, did finish. There we go. So we want to override did finish. This is essentially saying the web view is finished loading the content. What we can do here is have a script that is, let's see, how do we get how many numbers there are on this screen, right? We could do document.query selector, all list item, dot length. I mean, it's totally terrible code, but it totally will get us what we want. Expect this to be some sort of data attribute or what have you. Here we have this script. And what we're going to want to do here is on the web view evaluate this JavaScript. And that gives us a completion handler, which is I believe it's an object and an error. Sweet. And then if let object equals object as an integer, we want to print out, we found object rows. Else if let error equals error. Let's just see what happens here. I'm not sure if this is going to work or not, but it will be fun. So we're going to get some logging down in the bottom. Looks like we didn't get anything. Let's make sure we're getting called here. Oops. Intercept the native view. So we're not getting called into the did finish navigation for some reason. This web view might need to be on the screen to load. There we are. Okay, so it needed to actually be on the view hierarchy somewhere for it to load. So now when we run this, continue, okay. We got somewhere with that one. So here, now that we have those 10, let's set a property called rows. You know what we'll do? We'll start it as 0. Here, we'll return the number of rows, right? And down here, where we found that many rows, we're going to say self.rows equals object. And we're going to say self.reload data, or table view.reload data. That's going to essentially say the data has changed, trigger an update, and only render those 10. So if all worked well, we should only render 10 rows instead of all 100. And we did. Not bad. And we should still have the same functionality, but if we click row 7, we get number 7 to pop up. So this is a pretty dirty approach, but what's happening, like, let's review real quick. Let's recap. We had kind of this hidden web view running in the background that's only needed to make a request to this endpoint, so to speak, to this index or HTML page. Once it finishes loading with the delegate, we evaluate a script to see how many list items there are on the page. And then we set that as the number of rows that we want to render. This could definitely be modified to start looking at something where we have, numbers. We could do a meta tag, like a data native rows equals 10. We could do something like that. And then our actual query would be something more lines of, let's give it an ID of, oh man, how do I query for a meta tag based on data? This would be query selector. Well, you know what? I'm not going to do that. This works. But that would be how you could start to extrapolate this into something that's more, a little more extendable. We could start having data attributes. We could start building out native screens based on the content of the rendered HTML on the web-based view, not just based on some sort of API request. The only thing to call out here is that we are kind of jumping through a fair amount of hoops. We are creating a kind of phantom web view just to not deal with a native API request. If this was what we were trying to build for one screen, sure, great, let's do it. But if we had this same kind of code across multiple screens, I think I would lean more towards having this be a real, quote, HTTP request and making a JSON request to our server that's authenticated and can return structured data that we then parse out. Because once you have that scaffolding in place once, you then are able to use it multiple times over and over again across different screens. But then you're just building a native app. So you have an API to maintain, you have a JSON endpoint, you have to worry about authentication and getting all the stuff that comes with the normal JSON API. So trade-offs there for sure. I think that what we just demoed was extremely powerful, and there's just one way of enhancing views from the web view. It's a great question to ask, Marco. I think that if that's all the way at the beginning end of the spectrum, all the way at the end is rendering Swift UI directly from our Rails app, like you were talking about earlier, with the, let's see if I can pull it up, doing this with Flex directly from the server, which I think we're still pretty far ways off. But if you've been toying with it, again, I'd love to see that. So definitely let me know. And thanks for the question there. Okay, so that is going to wrap up for today. Thank you everyone for joining. We're just under the hour mark here. I really appreciate you coming out and asking questions, especially those who asked that stuff. A quick plug, if you are looking for more help on this stuff, I'm running a workshop. What's the one from? I'm running a workshop a week from Monday. So in just a little over 7 days, this is a 3-hour intensive workshop where we'll be working together with a small group of less than 20 on how to build turbo native apps for iOS, like from start to finish. You only need to know a little bit of Swift, and I'm going to give you a handout before then, which you can review in 30 minutes before the workshop. So would definitely recommend checking that out if you are interested in learning more. And if you have any questions on Swift UI, on Turbo Native, on whatever you have or need help with, don't hesitate to reach out. My email is right there, and I will be more than happy to answer any questions you have. So thank you again, everyone. I appreciate you joining. I appreciate the questions, and I will see you all next time. Have a good one. Bye-bye.